All right. And here we are with probably someone who needs no introduction, but we have Byron Donalds with us now. And we have the Home Education Foundation has put together a list of questions, and we're going to roll into them. Byron, thank you for being with us today. I really appreciate you making the time for the home education community to ask you some questions and get some answers that are just about education.
But I'm excited to be with you. Looking forward to the conversation. And so, whenever you're ready, let's begin.
All right. Before we jump right in, tell me something about you that maybe our viewers or listeners haven't heard yet. To help connect with who you are and something they may not know. Just
Something people haven't heard about me at this point. That's a tough one. It seems about every day I'm getting asked something, but I'll give you this one.
okay.
When I was in my church, my wife and I, we were youth leaders for a decade. So every summer I would take a week off, a week of my vacation from my company, and we would take the teenagers in our youth group to camp. And it was a week long camp, and I either was working security or organizing the games and like being a head referee. And so it's one of those deals where you're just out having a lot of fun and really helping to mentor, teenagers, which is it's a tough time in everybody's life. Teenage years are interesting years. The other interesting part is I spent really about 15 years coaching youth sports, football, basketball. Really love sports. I'm probably that coach that's yelled at a referee or two. Not even probably, I am. I've yelled at my fair share of referees. So
That's
I'm
great.
pretty intense, especially when it comes to competition. So that's stuff that I don't get a chance to talk about. Figured I'd share.
That's great. I think that's some nice things that a lot of people can resonate with for sure. All right. Well, let's dive into these questions. To try to keep it fair, we asked all the candidates the same questions.
Mhm.
And so I'll just roll them off. Question one is: in your view, does the state grant parents the right to educate their children, or does the state merely recognize an innate right that already belongs to the parents?
This is actually a good question. And I think before I got to the legislature back in 2016, I think the state viewed it as an innate right. My colleague, Erin Grawl, who's now in the state Senate, we served together in the House. At the time, she was drafting her Parental Bill of Rights, which was the first time there was a section of that in Florida statutes. I know that a good chunk of it is now passed, and Governor DeSantis signed that into law. And so the governor, and this is to his credit, has really been moving the needle in terms of parents taking full responsibility for their children and not just being like kind of recognized by the state, but really being the rightful position that children belong to their parents, and parents have to be leading the charge, especially when it comes to education. And so under my administration, that we're going to continue that. I believe that parents are at the head of the table. You parents are the ones that make those decisions. The state, and if it has roles to it, is to help basically to help facilitate avenues for parents to take the lead. But parents are the ones who need to be making the determinate decision making for their children. They know their children better than anybody else, and we want parents to have the ability to fully direct the direction that their children take.
Very good. I didn't say this at the beginning, but any leftover time from this we'll kind of use at the end and allow. But it's about 2 minutes per question. You didn't go over. I
Okay,
failed to
all
say
right.
that at the beginning. I don't want it to be clear. So you're good. You're good. That's just my clarification. All right, and in good answer. Question number two: Florida law explicitly outlines what school districts can and cannot require of home education families. But parents frequently report that local district staff overstep their boundaries by requiring unauthorized paperwork or pressuring them in ways that step beyond their authority. As governor, how would you ensure local county school boards and superintendents respect the limits placed on them by state statutes?
So listen, another great question. Typically, we find whether it's districts or other forms of local government, they find ways to kind of step past what Florida statutes has allowed for. I think in this instance, it requires the Department of Education at the state level to really enforce the boundaries of what a school district can and cannot do, and not just allowing the district to essentially have mission creep in a lot of these fields, especially when it comes to parents, especially with homeschool parents who are trying to just make those decisions on behalf of their children, as they have every right to do.
All right, thank you for your answer. Question 3. Do you think the educational landscape has grown too quickly in recent years in the name of school choice and innovation? Some think that perhaps we've flown the flag of innovation and in the process of that maybe ruined public schools or had a massive negative impact on public schools. And do you think, well, I'll let you answer that one first and then there's a follow up.
I don't think so. I think people who try to put a cap on innovation or try to put innovation in the box really don't allow for the beauty of the free market to create the next wave of maybe it's policies, or maybe it's some sort of innovation, or even the actual environment that, in this instance, education can take place in. I know for some of the larger school districts, it's been disruptive, and I understand that. But I think that begs the question that because we've been so innovative in Florida, parents now have a real opportunity to make decisions on behalf of their children. If parents are choosing other means for education than the traditional district, and it's causing disruption to the traditional district, then what that does mean from a market perspective is that the district was not really addressing the needs and the desires of parents. And so, yes, there's been some disruption, but I think that disruption only is going to benefit the children of the state of Florida.
You kind of already answered the follow up, but I'll ask it anyway. It's do you think it's important to preserve public schools as they are, or do you think it's time for public schools to perhaps look at the model and adapt to some of that education innovation?
Yeah, they need to look at the market and adapt for themselves. And I think the districts, if I were going to be in their position, yeah, I would assume they're very concerned, or if not terrified, because the landscape has changed really over the last 6-7 years in Florida. And that's, if you were the monopoly in any industry, that would be a very a scary time for you. But I think it's also a golden opportunity for the school districts. The school districts, if I were a superintendent, I would be looking at ways to be far more dynamic, far more nimble, to be able to attract parents to my institutions. And I think trying to live in the past or hoping that the legislature will change the rules or change the funding formulas to preserve them, that actually diminishes the innovation that we all want to see. I believe there should be an economy of education. I think it should be very broad. I think there should be many different pathways, many different options. And I think that's only leads to the betterment of the children, and it's to the best interest of the parents who want their kids to have the most dynamic and best academic experience while their kids are at home.
All right. Thank you for that answer. I appreciate it. I'm glad I asked the follow-up because you had a lot more to say. So that's great. So question 4, as the Home Education Foundation, we really don't like the term school choice. We find it reductive, and we prefer to look at things from the standpoint of educational choice and look at it more broadly and open. With the expansion of the customized educational choices like the PEP program, funding is increasingly entering private sectors. Scholarship funding organizations are raising the funds to meet the needs of those parents and students in those programs. How will your administration protect the private funding models from the inevitable regulatory strings and oversight that might come in to make them conform to be more like the public school model?
Well, first, let's take the end of your question. The end of your question, I think conformity to the public school model, it would be going backwards from where Florida is naturally going because of parents choosing the environment. And so I don't want to do that. I think that would not be in the best interest of kids. I think in terms of what we call it, to be honest, as an elected official, I've used school choice a lot. And I've also used parental choice. My wife, she uses educational freedom. I think in terms of the words we put to it, I think I can understand where there will be concerns about just wanting to be confined to schools in terms of how we know them to be brick and mortar buildings that have either grades K through 8 or K through 12 or 9 through 12 or whatever the case might be. I think for me, like I was saying earlier, it's really just about having an economy of education. So if it's traditional public schools, that falls within the box. If there are charters, that falls within. If there are homeschools, that falls within. Co-ops, private schools, religious schools. To me, as long as a child is getting educated, that then creates the contours of what the economy looks like. In terms of the funding apparatus, we want to make sure that the funding apparatus is nimble and flexible enough to be able to accomplish all of those. I guess I'll call them avenues. I don't want to put them into a box, but as long as the funding is allowed to allow for all those various avenues where education occurs to be funded, so kids can get the things that they need and that they deserve.
Understood. All right. This next question is question 5. It's a little similar, but maybe further down the track. So there are those in the home education community, especially here in Florida, who they fear what the funding does in coming with strings attached. And certainly history kind of does bear some of that out. How will your administration protect the traditional, completely self-funded home education programs from the potential regulatory whiplash or oversight that tends to follow public tax dollars?
Well, this is an interesting question. I think the accountability landscape in Florida under my administration, I think we're going to see some changes. I think there need to be. If you look at the accountability framework just for the K-12 system, I actually think it's kind of outdated. And that's something that needs to be brought into where we are today. I think, for the time we have been, even since Jeb Bush's A-plus plan, and let me be clear, at that time in Florida's history, we needed Jeb Bush's A-plus plan. There's no doubt about that. I think the history has been clear how that's been very helpful to understanding our kids even learning in some of these schools. I think that's important. But where we are right now, especially with technology today, I think progress monitoring is probably more capable today than it ever has been. I think if you're going to talk about in the homeschool environment, that's a very different environment altogether. I think in the homeschool environment, it's really more output driven that parents are seeing. And I think, there's many outputs of that. If a child is homeschooled from kindergarten to 5th grade, then they get integrated in middle school or they get integrated in high school. Integration meaning going to a school, not a public school, but just any school. I think there's that question of, well, where does the child in terms of their ability to enter a more traditional classroom environment in order to then move along with that classroom environment. But I think that's kind of where the beginning and end of it is. I think for homeschool parents, it's very different if you're going to talk about accountability measures versus large institutions that are being put together where you have millions, if not tens of millions of dollars going into a school environment.
Yeah, and if I could maybe restate the question a little bit more narrowly, I appreciate your answer, but we have some listeners who are very fiercely freedom loving and don't want any regulation at all on the home education program. So in a hyper focus follow up to this question, for the parents who aren't taking part in funds or systems, they're enjoying the freedoms of the home education under 1002.41 statutes. The question is, as far as the regulatory whiplash that comes from the spotlight being put on some of these programs that do get the funding, is there chance of seeing the home education crowd who isn't being funded by those programs swept up into some of those regulations?
Oh, no, absolutely not. No, not whatsoever. I do know that there are parents, and quite frankly, we have private schools that don't want to be a part of the funding program. And so then they continue to operate like they have been. And I think that's something where if you make that choice of your own volition, that's fine by me. I have no problems with that.
All right. Question number 6. It's been 111 years since 1915. Florida has had mandatory public school attendance laws from the ages of 6 to 16. And you had spoken recently and said 44% of Florida students are not reading on grade level. Do you think it's time to look at a more dramatic update to the model and borrow from some of the private sector?
I do. Oh, absolutely, I do. I think a couple of reasons. One, the public school system, as we've known it, it's always kind of opposed or has been dragged into innovation. And I think probably the better word is dragged into innovation. They've only decided to make changes when it became very clear, not just from an outcome perspective, but from a political perspective, that they had no choice. And so they're kind of in this position of, if we don't make a change now, we could be in more trouble down the line. And I think that leads to kind of perverse incentives. I think what we should be doing is making sure that a lot of these, and frankly, and not even forget the schools for a moment, in the framework upon which Florida is going to set standards, we should be making sure that we're following best practices and what helps kids read online. And to be real specific, for me, that's the science of reading. That's understanding phonetical awareness early on, being able to conjugate and break down complex texts over time. To be honest, a lot of homeschool parents and families have been doing this for decades in Florida and continue to do that today. And so what that's really proven is that it's a far better model for literacy and for reading comprehension than any fad that has gone through the educational system over the last 60 years in the United States overall, and obviously in Florida. So, I mean, I hope I answered your question there, but I think what we want to do is really just be focused on tried and true methods, make sure that we're implementing those. And I think from the state's perspective, it's about pushing that out to schools and to districts, so that they, especially the ones obviously they're under the public system, that's the model that they're following. And if it ends up with, not even if, I know it will, when it ends up with kids reading at significantly higher levels, mastering math and reading and writing, that's only to the benefit of kids. And so I think we need to take a serious look at that. The grading system, it's time for a complete upgrade of the grading system in Florida. I think that can only be to the betterment of our children.
Thank you for your answer. This next one has a bit of a lead up, so bear with me. There were some kind of stats and reports that we had sent over for you to take a look at. They showed that homeschooled students, on average, score 130 points higher than public school students when it comes to entering into the college environment. And over 78% of peer-reviewed studies confirmed that homeschool students perform statistically significantly better than public school students on those standardized assessments. What can institutions of higher education and even some of our K-12 schools do a little better to borrow from what has worked for some of these students?
You know, this is where I think for the traditional schools, this is where it somewhat can get complicated. Because let's examine homeschooling for a moment. You have a parent, obviously, who's taking time for their children, are sourcing probably the best material possible to help educate their kids, and then also are taking some of the individual time to make sure reinforcement is encouraged. And I think that's also one of the key things. I think the other thing with homeschooling, which has always been an advantage over traditional schooling, is that a parent is taking the time and the energy to make sure that the child is mastering skill sets before they move on to the next skill set, which is something that in a large class environment, if we just look at the data speaks for itself, has just not been occurring. So I think if there's something that to be taken from the homeschool environment, it's making sure that our kids are mastering material before they move on to the next level of material. I think if you can't really look at it in terms of, oh, well, they scored this on the third grade benchmark test, or they scored this on the fourth grade NAEP, or they scored this on the eighth grade test, or whatever the case might be. It's making sure that as kids are moving between grades, that they're mastering subject matter at each grade. The other thing that I think the traditional schools are really going to have to look at is how are we going to deal with tutoring? I think that tutoring, especially during the summertime, is going to be really important for a lot of kids because summer slide is real. You have a child who's out of school for 2.5 months. They're not, whatever's going on at home is what's going on at home. But when they come back to the classroom, what we've seen is that typically the school districts are having to re-educate or remediate from last year's material before they move into the next material for the next grade. And so I think these are some of the things that I think if the school districts are taking a look at and trying to understand the dynamics of what happens in the homeschool environment versus the traditional environment, I think a lot of it is really around the tools and the training to master subject matter before they move on. I think to your point, what the data yields, it demonstrates scaffolding, I think. And I talk about it in terms of scaffolding, especially mathematics, because if you're a contractor, if you're going to build a skyscraper, you can't build a scaffold up to build the next floor unless the floors below it are sturdy and strong and stable. Well, in mathematics, it's very hard to teach a kid Algebra 1 if they had struggles in 6th grade and 4th grade math. because it all builds on top of each other. And I think that's what the traditional schools are going to have to really come to grips with if they're going to be able to compete with the other avenues of education in Florida's economy of education.
Thank you for the answer. Question number 8. Home education, especially here in Florida, has been full of a history of experimenting to discover what works. And there's some adapting. We do things and they don't work, and we throw them out, and we pivot. And that is the kind of the beauty of home education. And as money has started to be invested into established communities, and put towards some valid opportunities, there's also some backlash that arises. And this isn't necessarily a home education only question, but it's for kind of the overall expansion of the education landscape and the freedom of choices in it. How do we protect the entire education landscape's freedom and independence and foster the innovation to ensure that attempts for oversight don't shipwreck the potential to raise all ships with that rising tide?
This is actually a really good question. I think that when you're talking about how do you allow for the innovation to take place without stifling it because of checklists, I think the way you do that is you want to encourage an innovative environment. Here's what we know, not just in education, but in life. If all you do is stay to a static model and you just say that nothing ever fails, you also have to ask yourself the same question: does something have an opportunity to succeed? And what I mean by that is that let's take homeschooling, because it's a very personal one-on-one environment. Yes, you can try a new method of teaching science, for an example, and if it's not bearing fruit, it's easy to get rid of that. And like we were talking about in the previous question, kind of going back, making sure that those concepts are being retaught before you move on to the next level. Right. When you're dealing with large systems, the large systems typically are not nearly as nimble. So there is a desire to not do that, or to, quite frankly, take longer with a process that's not working. Common Core would be an excellent example of that. Take longer with a process that's not working, and then you kind of change the grading or you change the accountability so that nobody has to admit it was not working. I think that's just not healthy. So from my perspective, as being the state's next governor, I'm not going to get caught up in somebody trying a new way, as long as it's based by, evidence of how we're going to teach science. Because if it doesn't work, or we start to see it doesn't work, I would rather the environment, quite frankly, I would rather the administration and the bureaucracy pull it out quickly and then go back and try to redo that, as opposed to try to change the entire accountability spectrum to basically say that we know this wasn't as good as the last one, but it's okay because it's what we got. And I think what you really want to have is a very nimble system of accountability, so that even though there are things that are innovatively tried, we still have time for that child to help that child progress to the next level that they need to progress to. And this has been my concern for a long time with traditional public schools, is that they were too caught up in trying to justify the decision for the new fad, as opposed to acknowledging it's not working and making sure these kids get what they need before they move on, because the kid only has one shot at their education. The adults, we can try and try and try again. And I think also with where we are today, for the most part, we pretty much know what works in education. We know what works. The question is there the diligence and the desire to make sure that we're implementing that and we're executing that for children?
All right, thank you. Question 9. The higher representation of special needs children kind of rests in the homeschool community, with about 24% of families having a student with a disability versus in the public school environment, about 14% is that threshold. For many families, home education isn't an alternative. It's the only setting where their child can genuinely succeed. What do you think about the FEA's recently filed lawsuit against the home education families with children with special needs who use the FESUA scholarship, stating that it was unconstitutional to fund them?
No, I disagree with the union, but that's not a shock. I disagree with them a lot on a myriad of issues. I think this is again one of the last gasps of the union trying to establish some semblance of control for the traditional system. But the truth is, you can't have a traditional system with 3.5 million kids. Every, children are obviously too different. And now in the environment today, lifestyles are so dynamic. We have parents who
Mhm.
work from home for a myriad of reasons. We have parents who travel a lot, but they still have obviously so the home dynamics are far more different today in America than they were 60 years ago or 30 years ago. That's a fact. That's just very clear. And so I think it's important that those students, those families with students with special needs, they get access to every tool that they can get access to for the matriculation of that child. This is where my wife and I, our view is that these dollars really are because as a society we have decided we've made the bet long ago in the United States of America that education and the funding of education is critical for the future of our nation and it's critical for the future of our state. And I'm not interested in arguing with bureaucrats or arguing with unions about how those dollars are disseminated. I think those dollars should be disseminated so that children can get access to them and help them um, get educated and prepare themselves to be functioning adults who have an ability to be economically viable for themselves so they can build families for themselves. And I think that's what matters more than anything else. I'm opposed to the union's lawsuit. That doesn't make any sense to me. We should be empowering parents and helping these children, not fighting over dollars.
All right. Final question, question number 10. This one has a little bit of a lead up, so bear with me.
Sure.
As the home education community, we love our freedoms. Our children are not mere creatures of the state, and for 40 plus years here in Florida, our families have paid their taxes into the public education system while simultaneously taking our children and making the personal sacrifices necessary to pay out of our own pockets to provide their educational needs and opportunities. And we've been met with resistance at many turns. We've
Mhm.
a little deeply unsettled at the current political climate, and we don't care about skin color or jersey color or side of the aisle. We want to know that we can work and that what we earn will be ours. The decisions that we make to raise our children are ours. And we want to know that we have a candidate who understands the sacred duty and burden of responsibility that every parent has and supports that by recognizing their rights and fighting to protect them at every turn. Um, you have 2 minutes on the clock. You can say anything you would like to say to earn their vote. This is your community. This is who's listening. Go ahead.
Well, first of all, it's a pleasure and really an honor to be here with everybody. When I got into politics a decade ago, the reason why I ran for the state house is because I wanted to be a champion for education freedom in the state of Florida. This was before the family empowerment scholarships or many other scholarships that everybody takes advantage of today. But on a personal level, my mom was a school choice mom before school choice was even a thing. And that was back in the early 80s in New York City. I know innately from my mother and even watching my wife with my own three sons that parents deserve and must be at the head of the table. And so, as governor, we're going to protect that. We're going to enhance that. We want parents to be making these determinations, not the state, not bureaucrats. We know that when parents are making these decisions with dollars, that they're going to make them far, far better than any of us can tell you what to do with those dollars. And so, that's my commitment to the families of Florida that we will protect your rights. These are your children. It is your responsibility to educate them. And we want to make sure that you have every resource at your disposal in order to do that. In terms of bureaucracy and in terms of regulation, we want to have an economy of education in our state. And the reason why I believe so strongly in that is because we've seen what the past has brought us. Most of our kids are not mastering math, reading, and writing by the time they graduate high school. Many of them do not have a plan for success or a pathway towards success. And what we are seeing are young people who are now frustrated and concerned about their futures. If we look at the past and realize that it's not worked for our children, then maybe the better path forward is to give all the parents all the autonomy that they need for the future of their children. And maybe, just maybe, we'll have a world-class K-12 education system, as diverse and dynamic as it may be, that puts children in the best place to be possible for them to succeed for their futures. So I'm asking for your vote on August 18th. My pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
Byron, thank you for taking your time out of your absolutely busy schedule and squeezing us in. This is last minute for those of you who don't know. We will be going live tomorrow. And I appreciate you for taking that and making that personal sacrifice and taking that time to be with us and to for our community to hear from you. So thank you again.
No problem at all. Thank you.